You're listening to Growing Hope Conversations, the podcast from Growing Hope, a charity offering free therapy for children and young people with additional needs and support for their families. Join our host Bambi French as she welcomes guests who've been there, sharing real stories, honest struggles, and how churches can truly make a difference.
Erin, welcome to the Growing Hope podcast. How are you?
Good, thanks. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, it's good to have you. So before we get started, can you just tell us all about who you are? Who is Erin? What it is that you do?
So I'm Erin Burnett. I am 26. I feel like once you're in your 20s, you have to think for a second, like, how old am I? But I think I'm 26. Anyway, currently, I'm a master's student at the University of Aberdeen, but I am from Northern Ireland. And I have written a book about autism in the church. And this is based on my own personal experience as a Christian who is autistic and was trying to work out what all that meant. And aside from when I'm not studying, I love traveling, I love cats, I love rabbits, I love anything that's like small and fluffy.
Amazing. So well-travelled, well-read person, so you're going to have lots to talk about. So you've indicated, you've told us that you've written a book that is based on your experience of being an autistic teen in the church. Can you just kind of rewind a little bit and tell us a little bit about that journey, the journey of growing up, receiving a diagnosis, and being part of church? Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, so I've always grown up in a Christian household. Northern Ireland, on the whole, tends to be quite church-going as a society. So that was a fairly usual thing to do. And like a lot of people, I don't think I really took my faith all that seriously until you hit some sort of stumbling block. And then all of a sudden, you have to start thinking things through. So for me, that came whenever I started secondary school. So I found primary school fine. I went to this like small country primary school. It was all cute and cozy. I had no problems. And then all of a sudden you're thrown into this like city secondary school. And I mean, that's difficult enough for even neurotypical kids, but it was a disaster. I basically just never made friends. And I'm very fortunate in that, I wasn't bullied. I wasn't deliberately excluded or anything like that. I just simply couldn't do it. And I just didn't quite know why. Round about that time, so I ended up being referred to CAMHS, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, rather similar to England. Initially, I was diagnosed with social anxiety, was treated based on that. But I didn't feel like it was quite getting to the root of the issue, because it wasn't that I was anxious about socializing per se. It was more that I literally just didn't know what to do. So I mean, the people I worked with in CAMHS were brilliant. It's just we weren't necessarily focusing on the right issue. And that continued up until I was 18, ready to be discharged. And honestly, I thank God for this. It was just a single discharge meeting with this lady who I'd literally never met before. I was about to be basically sent away from the service, and she just said, "Have you ever considered autism?" Just out of the blue. And it was honestly like one of those light bulb moments people talk about, because I mean, I knew what autism was, but I think like a lot of people, I associated it with boys primarily. I hadn't necessarily seen that representation within girls. But when she mentioned it and, briefly talked about some of the characteristics, it was really like things just fell into place. And I was like, oh my word, I think that's it. And again, I'm just so grateful because it was a one-off discharge review and if she hadn't have just said that, I might never have come to that conclusion. But that was quite transformative. But, and again, I'm sure it's the same in England, the waiting list to be diagnosed as an adult, as I was then, ridiculous. Like it would have been 3-4 years, and I was quite keen to get something in place before I went to university. So, I had the privilege that my family could get me a private diagnosis, but of course not everyone has that privilege. So that's something else I'm very grateful for. And because I was able to get that diagnosis finally when I was 18, university was just so much better for me. I think it's because I had a better understanding of myself. I was getting support. I was also studying a subject I loved, surrounded by other people who loved that subject. I studied theology. So yeah, it was like night and day. School was awful. University was great. I mean, that's a bit of a black and white way of putting it. But
do you think that school was so awful and university was better because you had an answer to maybe the questions that you'd been asking about yourself the whole way through school? Is it as simple as that?
I think that's a major part of it, because I was able to acknowledge that I'm not broken. It's not that something is wrong with me. I'm just different. And also simply with the university environment being different, it's a lot easier to find your tribe, as it were.
You were in church. You'd grown up in church. You'd been going to church, and then found that you have, a disability. Did that impact? Did you finding out and having that diagnosis? Did that impact on you and your faith at that point? What did that look like at that point?
It did. Yeah. So going back to when I was in school before I was diagnosed, that's when I started taking faith more seriously, because things weren't going well in my life, and the Bible was a source of comfort for me. So particularly this idea of, there's a verse, I think it's in John, where Jesus says to his disciples, I don't call you servants, I call you friends. And just that image was quite powerful for me, and it was something I clung to. However, the way I then began to approach faith was not the most healthy. And in hindsight, I can attribute that to autism. But of course, at the time, I didn't really know that. And by that, I mean, I was really obsessed with rule following, needing to be perfect before God. And that also made me a rather judgmental person. I can't have been very nice to be around, because like I say, I was just obsessed with following all the rules of the Bible. And ultimately, I think it's because I just didn't want to be a disappointment to God. So fast forwarding to the diagnosis, that allowed me to start approaching my faith in a more healthy way, because I realized, God is a God of grace. He also made me the way I am. His yoke is easy and his burden is light. So clearly my approach is not what he intends for me. And also the fact I was going in to study theology was also very helpful, because the very nature of studying theology is that you explore different perspectives, you meet different people, and ultimately I came out of that with a much more healthy faith.
Okay. Yeah. Because I always think about, I was diagnosed at 15 with a visual impairment. I would think about teenagers who are in church, and seeing all of the things that go on around sort of prayer and healing and all of those sorts of things, and how they're affected by or impacted by a diagnosis, whether that be of autism, whether that be of visual loss or hearing loss. And I think it's really important that those discussions are had, because it's a very formative time, isn't it, in your life, when you're thinking about what it is you're going to do and where you're going to go next. And like you said, I guess the impact was around you following rules, and some people can look at the Bible as, as a set of rules that must be followed and must be obeyed. And if you don't, then, there's going to be a problem. But then, like you say, we serve a God of grace. So who is patient, who is patient with us to kind of get us to where we need to be. So that's really, really great. Yeah. So you went through university with autism, which is, you said was a better experience for you. What did you studied theology, didn't you? You studied theology, and then you're now doing a master's in theology as well?
Yes, so I've kept up the theology, and in particular, I really like what's called practical theology, which is essentially, as the name suggests, applying the Bible to real life. I've always liked doing theology in a way that impacts real life and isn't just super academic. Even though the academic stuff's important, I like the real world application, which is actually how my book came about. So when I was still finishing up my undergrad, which was at Queen's in Belfast, we had the opportunity to do a dissertation, and I wanted to do mine on pastoral care of autistic adults in the church. And I particularly identified adults, well, for two reasons. The practical reason was it's a lot easier to be approved to do research with adults than children.
Oh, yeah.
But the more serious reason, other than that, was that at that time, more people were starting to write about autism in church, which was great, but it was all about children. And I was seeing a gap in, well, what about when these children grow up? And also, what about the increasing number of people like me who don't get their diagnosis until slightly later on? So that's what spurred me to do that project. And it was great fun because I got to interview people. I interviewed church leaders, parents, Christians themselves, and just hearing so many different perspectives, which I eventually pulled together into a dissertation, and that ultimately formed the basis of my book.
Your book, yeah. Okay, so that's a nice segue into what is your book called? Tell us the title of your book.
So it is called With All Your Mind, Autism and the Church, coming from that verse where we are to love God with all our heart, all our soul, all our mind. But of course, if you're neurodiverse, your mind works differently. So it's simply exploring how can Christians who also have autism relate to God in a way that is authentic to them.
And how have you found then that Christians with autism are relating to God? In what ways are they doing that?
So I think one of the most interesting findings of my research, and this is backed up by other scientific studies, is that people who are autistic tend to think less supernaturally, as in they're more likely to be agnostic and atheist. They find it harder to believe supernatural things, for example, miracle stories. And I recognize that in myself. So although I loved reading the Bible, obviously getting obsessed with rules, academic theology, I found the more supernatural stuff more difficult. For instance, having a personal relationship with Jesus, that I always found quite difficult to picture, even though I loved it as an idea. And my research proved, okay, thank goodness, I'm not the only one who has this problem. So that, of course, doesn't mean that every single autistic person will have that problem. There's plenty, I'm sure, that can just wholeheartedly accept all the supernatural stuff, no problem. But for those of us who struggle, I wanted to, with the help of the people who I interviewed, think about, well, how can I connect with God in a way that works with my mind? Ultimately, the conclusion I came to, and again, this is for myself, it will be different for everyone, but I feel closest to God whenever I'm doing something tangible. So, for example, whenever I form a connection with another person, or like the connections I have with my church family, I experience the love of God through that. I also experience the love of God when I'm, for example, just having a walk and admiring creation. So I find if I have something tangible, that helps me feel connected to God. More so than if I was sitting in a room with my eyes closed trying to pray. I would find that more difficult.
I think it's really powerful that you've said that, because even now, how, church and the church experience has evolved, hasn't it? And there's so much difference in different churches that you can go to and different ways that you can experience church. But there's kind of still that thought that you can only connect with God in a certain way. There are still communities that would say, well, you can only connect with God if you're sitting in a room with your eyes closed, or you're, in front of a huge altar, or, just certain, I guess, traditions and ways of worship that people have kind of said, well, this is the way. But actually what you're saying and what you're encouraging everyone, even the neurotypical, is that finding the way that you connect with God might look different from the normal way, or the way that we're told you must connect, and being okay with that. What are some of the ways? I mean, you've said you like walking in nature, but through your research, what are some of the other ways that people that you've spoken to and have talked to along the way, what are some of the ways in which they connect? I just want people listening to have ideas, to spark ideas of, actually, maybe I could connect with God in that particular way.
So one of the themes that came up was trying to align our gifts and interests with worshipping God. So autistic people tend to have very precise interests, and they're quite often quite talented in certain areas. So trying to align that with God and your walk with God. So in my case, it was writing. I've always enjoyed writing and reading. When I was able to channel that in a way that glorified God, that then helped me feel more connected to God. Likewise, one of the people I interviewed, she was incredibly musically talented. So she joined her church's worship team, and that was how she felt connected. And actually, what was quite interesting about her story is that autistic people tend to struggle with unpredictability, and contemporary churches, of which I'm a part of, they do tend to be quite unpredictable. But what this girl said to me is, well, I'm in the worship team. I can control what songs we sing because I'm in charge. So not only was she using her talents, it actually helped her in terms of she knew what was coming next because she was picking the songs. So it's just little things like that.
Yeah. But definitely aligning your gifts and talents. Again, I know we're talking specifically about people with autism, but actually if everyone can take something from that. Figure out what the gifts and talents are that God has given you, and use those to connect. Whether it's talking to people, not talking to people, being on the worship band and controlling what song comes next. All of those sorts of things are really, really, really important. Yeah, thank you.
And even certain interests that you might not think could be Christianized, if that's a word, actually can. So, for example, I did a talk with Scripture Union Scotland a while ago, and they're doing such cool things with their neurodiverse youth. So, for instance, they have a gaming club. Like, youth leaders who like gaming manage to combine a love of gaming and a love of sharing Jesus with young people. And it's like, that's fabulous. So, it doesn't have to be something typical like singing in church. It really could be anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Just find the thing. Yeah. And that it might take a little bit of time to find that, but even just asking maybe the youth group what, finding out what is it that you enjoy, and using that as a way forward. No, that's really good. There's a line in your book. Now I might know when I get it right. We'll see. Test me now. Be religious but not spiritual. Rather,
yes,
spiritual, not religious. Tell us what the line is, because I think I'm just like messing up your writing.
That's okay. So this came about when I was trying to convey how my way of relating with God was different. So what a lot of people say in modern times is that they're spiritual but not religious. I flipped that round and said, in my case, and with other people with autism, we are religious but not spiritual.
Okay.
And that was particularly when I was in school, if we go back. I had all the religion, I had the following rules, I had the academic theology, but the spiritual bit, the connection with God, that was what I found difficult. So that's what I meant when I say I am religious but not spiritual. Although, of course, as I have got to understand myself better, I have been able to practice spirituality in a way that suits me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like you say, it comes back to using those gifts, talents, doesn't it? And sometimes we can get lost in the language as well, can't we? Where it's actually, if we're just using the gifts and talents that God has given us to worship Him, to connect with Him, then that's what it is. We can have those conversations all day around religion and spirituality. But yes, understand what you're saying there. If people want to read some more of your book, where can they find it?
So, my website is Erin Burnett, which is BURNETT author.co.uk, and the links are there. I think if you search With All Your Mind, Autism in the Church, it should also come up on the likes of Amazon. Yeah, the ebook is cheaper than the print book because unfortunately the printing costs have gone up, but I try to keep it as cheap as possible.
That's all right. That's great. We will link to it, to all of that, your website and your book, in the show notes, so everyone can get themselves a copy. As we come to the end of the conversation, Growing Hope, works with families, with children with additional needs, and does a lot of work around supporting those children, but their families as well, going into schools, just getting that message about inclusion, especially within the church. And encouraging churches to include children and young people with additional needs. What would your advice be to church leaders and the church community around supporting children and young people with additional needs? I guess especially when there'll be a number of them who haven't yet been diagnosed or, receive a diagnosis quite late on in their childhood, into early adulthood. What would your advice be around, I guess, supporting the inclusion of these people within the church?
Yeah, so, well, I could talk both biblically and practically. So starting biblically, there's that great verse of the Apostle Paul where he compares the Christian church to a human body, how each part has a different role to play. One part is not greater than the other. In fact, the parts that might be considered weaker by society should actually then be given more honour in church. So it's essentially a topsy-turvy way of looking at things compared to how society might judge you. So that's a great picture, but how do we actually put that into practice, particularly thinking about children and young people? I think the main thing is be prepared to do things slightly differently, which we've touched on before. Take an individual approach because, every child with additional needs is different. You can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. So getting to know them or getting to know their family and just asking them, how can we help you? Because I certainly found that a lot of the classic youth group Sunday school stuff was sort of inaccessible for me because a lot of it just involved running around and screaming, which suits a lot of people, but no, it was just a nightmare. Even just, again, it doesn't mean you have to change it for everyone because that suits a lot of people, but just being prepared to think outside the box. Yeah. Okay, well, this child, they might not want to do the games because that's too loud. But what can they do? For example, I liked crafts and things like that were a bit more calm. And being able to come in and out. For example, I've spoken to families of children with autism who say, we send our son to Sunday school. He doesn't necessarily take part in everything, but he is allowed to pick and choose what he takes part in, what is too much. And just sort of allowing that flexibility rather than one size fits all, I think is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes, families feel more comfortable when they know that actually it's not a very rigid process where, Sunday school, you have to sit and do these things, all 10 activities or whatever is planned. They know that actually child will be supported to do as much as they feel that they can do or would like to do. It's a very different space, isn't it, from even school is, I suppose. And I always feel that churches need to be that place where people who have children with additional needs or have additional needs themselves, it needs to be the one place where people can go and feel as though they belong and that they are safe, and that they can connect with God in the way that He has created them to be and do. So yeah, that was really, really helpful. Thank you. Well, Erin, it has been fantastic to talk to you today. Have you enjoyed yourself?
Yes, no, it's been good fun.
It's been great. Okay, and I'm sure, lots of people will have, be able to resonate with your story and they'll get a lot out of what you said. And like I said, we will link to everything that you have mentioned in the show notes, your book, your website, your blog, so people can go and have a look and find out a little bit more about you. But thank you very much for being part of Growing Hope Conversations today. And yeah, we hope to speak to you soon.
Thank you very much. And just thank you for all the fantastic work that Growing Hope is doing.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Everyone should be able to access their church. In this podcast, you've heard how this isn't always easy for some people. Growing Hope's accessibility training helps churches become welcoming places for every child and family. We'll train your whole church community, not just to give your building wider doors and access ramps, but to help you change your culture so that every child and young person is welcome. Book your training today at growinghope.org.uk/churches.